particular transgressions that the Iranian regime has perpetrated over the...
And we'll break away as the U.S. House gavels in for a number of bills this afternoon, including one to allow more skilled foreign workers in the U.S. The U.S. House live here on C-SPAN.
Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken after 6:30 p.m. today. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3012, the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act of 2011, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 193, H.R. 3012, a bill to amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to eliminate the per-country numerical limitation for employment-based immigrants, to increase the per-country numerical limitation for family-sponsored immigrants, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, and the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 3012 as amended, currently under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 3012, the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. I'd first like to thank Chairman Smith for his work and diligence and commitment on this issue. We wouldn't be here today without his efforts and his commitment to this. I also want to thank Ranking Member Conyers and the Immigration Subcommittee Ranking Member Zoe Lofgren. She cares deeply about this and has also been very instrumental in putting this bill together to make it something that we hope would pass today. And her work on the Judiciary Committee. The Immigration and Nationality Act generally provides that the total number of employment-based immigrant visas made available to natives of any single foreign country in a year cannot exceed 7% of the total number of such visas made available in that year. The bill completely eliminates the per-country caps from employment-based visas and raises the per-country cap from 7% to 15% for family-based visas, all without adding even a single additional visa. In other words, there is no net increase in the total number of visas. And what I want members on both sides of the aisle to understand and recognize is there is not a net increase in the total number of visas. But it does make important adjustments that will allow us to better service and fix legal immigration, which is one of the commitments that I have in working in this Congress. While per-country limits make some limited sense in the area of family immigration, they make no sense in the context of employment-based immigration. American companies treat all high-skilled immigrants equally, regardless of where they come from. Our immigration policy should do the same. H.R. 3012 creates a fair and equitable first-come, first-served system. Under this system, U.S. companies will be able to focus on what they do best, hiring smart people to create products, services, and jobs for Americans. Per-country caps are the antithesis of the free market. Companies recruit employees based on their talent, not their country of origin. Hiring and keeping the best people, whether from America or from around the world, is the primary objective of American companies. This bill will make sure that employers meet that objective. Fears that these changes will lead to an influx of cheap labor are totally unfounded. Two concerns in particular rely on the false assumption that the removal of these caps will have a negative impact on American workers. First concern applies to the removal of the per-country cap on employment-based visas. Some people argue this provision will displace American workers with cheap foreign labor, which will not and cannot happen. Current law prohibits U.S. employers from hiring foreign workers to fill these jobs unless there is insufficient U.S. workers who are able, willing, qualified, and available. This bill does not change that requirement, but it does encourage high-skilled immigrants who are educated in the U.S. to stay and help build our economy rather than using the skills they learned here to aid our competitor nations. The second criticism I hear applies to the provision that raises the family-based per-country cap from 7% to 15%. The fears seem to be that this change will result in an increase of unskilled foreign immigrants who will be a burden to our system. To the contrary, those who benefit most under the family cap adjustment are law-abiding workers who have demonstrated their respect for the rule of law by waiting in line for many years, if not decades. An unmarried minor child in Mexico, for example, whose son or daughter of a U.S. citizen will receive a green card in November of this year, has been waiting in line since April 1993. That's an 18-and-a-half-year wait. Rewarding those who are patiently waiting to come to this country legally will incentivize more people to enter our country legally through the means that we have set forth. This bill does not add a single new green card to the system. There's no trick or compromise involved. We are sending a message that we want people to come to America legally, and we're sending that message without massive comprehensive reforms. This is simple, straightforward, and consistent with what I think most members from both sides of the aisle stand on the issue of immigration. This legislation is pro-growth, it's pro-jobs, and it's pro-family. I'd like to thank the Compete America and Immigration Voice for their tireless efforts in helping to get this bill passed, and again thank Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Conyers, and Ms. Lofgren for their work in helping to bring this bill forward. At this time, I would actually also ask that I would ask unanimous consent. I'll withdraw that for a second, but I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you. I also rise in support of this bipartisan proposal that provides two small technical fixes to our country's immigration laws. I'd take the balance of the time that I have allotted to me to make this statement. The bill removes the so-called per-country limits from applying to employment-based green cards. Current immigration law provides 140,000 green cards annually to employment-based immigrants. The law, however, prevents any one country from receiving more than 7% or 9,800 of the total 140,000 visas. Because of this per-country limit, a country like India, with a population of 1.2 billion, is limited to the same number of visas as a country like Iceland, with a population of 300,000 and a lot of ice. This makes no sense and has resulted in decades-long backlogs for nationals from India as well as China. And it makes it impossible for certain U.S. employers to attract and retain certain essential workers they need to help keep America competitive. Indeed, from India and China, there are many people trained in STEM areas that we need in our country to keep competitive. Eliminating the per-country limit for employment-based immigrants would level the playing field and treat everyone on a first-come, first-served basis. Because the bill does not provide additional green cards, it does not address the current overall backlogs, and that's unfortunate. But the bill does treat people in those backlogs more equitably. And to make sure that there are no unintended consequences, the elimination of per-country limit is phased in slowly over 3 years. The bill also raises the per-country limit for family-based immigrants from 7% to 15%. This would have a similar effect of making the treatment of such immigrants more equitable. These fixes are small, but they mean a great deal to the people that they do help. H.R. 3012 is supported by quite a few business groups, including the United States Chamber of Commerce, Compete America, and the American Council on International Personnel, and is supported for advocates for American and immigrant families, including the Asian American Justice Center and the National Immigration Law Center. I, like my colleague on the other side, want to thank the people who are above me on the committee level, the chairman in particular, Chairman Smith, and the ranking member of our subcommittee, Zoe Lofgren, who has worked with Congressman Chaffetz, who worked so hard on this bill, and Chairman Smith to get this bipartisan bill through the committee and to the floor. It's important that we do get bipartisan bills through, and because of our chairman, we have that opportunity on occasion to do such a thing. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I'd now like to recognize the chairman of our full committee, Mr. Lamar Smith of Texas, and yield so much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Utah for yielding me time, and I also want to thank him for his sponsorship of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, our immigration system should be designed to benefit Americans and our economy. And this bill introduced by Congressman Chaffetz does just that, and I'm happy to be a co-sponsor. The Immigration and Nationality Act generally provides that the total number of family-sponsored and employment-based green cards available to natives of any one country cannot exceed 7% of the total number of green cards available each year. Because of these annual numerical caps on green cards and the fact that some countries have more of the skilled workers that American employers want, natives of these countries must often wait years longer for green cards than natives of other countries. For foreign professionals with advanced degrees and aliens of exceptional ability, green cards are now immediately available to approved applicants from most countries. However, because employers seek so many workers from India and China, the per-country caps result in green cards only being available to these individuals who first applied before November 2007, 4 years ago. For foreign professionals with bachelor's degrees and skilled workers, green cards are now available to applicants from most countries who first applied on or before December 2005. However, for the same reason, because employers seek so many workers from India and China, the per-country cap result in green cards only being available to those from China who first applied before August 2004 and for those from India before July 2002. Similar per-country caps exist in the family-sponsored green card categories. That's why natives of most countries who are siblings of U.S. citizens will get green cards only if they first applied before June 2000, 11 years ago. And siblings from the Philippines have had to wait since 1988. H.R. 3012, the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, eliminates the employment-based per-country cap entirely by fiscal year 2015. It also raises the family-sponsored per-country cap from 7% to 15%. This legislation makes sense. Why should American employers who seek green cards for skilled foreign workers have to wait longer just because the workers are from India or China? American business employers have already proved to the U.S. government that they need these workers, that qualified Americans are not available, and that American workers will not be harmed. It makes sense to repeal the employment-based per-country caps. So I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3012. And before I yield back the balance of my time, again, I want to thank the gentleman from Utah for sponsoring this legislation.
Reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you. I'd like to yield 2 minutes and 56 seconds to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to take full advantage of those extra 56 seconds. Mr. Speaker, I'm a co-sponsor of this bipartisan legislation, and I want to speak on its behalf. I heard about a conversation that Bill Clinton had with Steve Jobs. The Apple computer has about 200,000 employees outside of the borders of the United States, I understand. And I believe it's Walter Isaacson in his biography of Steve Jobs talks about a conversation he had with President Clinton where the president asked, what would it take to get all those employees back into the United States? And Mr. Jobs said, you give me 30,000 highly skilled workers in the United States, and we'll bring those jobs back. And that's what this is about. It's having access within the United States to the most highly skilled engineers, scientists, mathematicians that will in turn generate the kind of economic activity that we all want in terms of job creation and national economic growth. Now, in the Northern Virginia area, we're very fortunate. We have a strong high-tech sector. But for that tech sector to continue to grow and expand, we have got to have a workforce not only adequate in terms of quantity, but particularly in terms of quality. We know how important technology firms are going to be in the global economy of the 21st century. But I don't think we fully take into account how important this kind of legislation is, where we can continue to attract the best and brightest from around the world, who in fact do want to go to graduate school here and do want to continue residing in the United States and to work here, applying their talents and skills. Now, under current law, employment-based and family-sponsored immigrant visas for the natives of any particular country can't exceed 7% of the total of those visas made available that year. That cap hinders the ability of high-tech firms in the United States to hire the top talent from countries like India and China, who have a disproportionately large number of individuals with the education and the experience that are sought after by many of these technology companies. It doesn't make sense to continue enforcing outdated, arbitrary caps that make it harder for companies to hire the employees that they need and we need to grow and prosper within the United States. This legislation eliminates per-country limits on allotment of high-skilled green cards without adding a single additional green card to the system. It also increases per-country limits from 7% to 15%, more than doubles in the family-based immigration system, helping reduce substantial backlogs in the family-based system as well. It doesn't add any additional visas, but rather it more rationally distributes the allotment already available. May I have another, do you have another minute?
I would yield the gentleman as much time as he may consume and needs.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'll try to be judicious in using that time. I very much thank my good friend from Memphis for yielding me the time. This legislation is modest in scope, but it is very important because it puts this country in the right direction of economic growth. Now, I want to say I wish we would set our ambitions higher in the whole area of immigration. Our immigration system is broken. It needs a fundamental overhaul. And we ought to have comprehensive immigration reform that makes strategic investments in border security, improves workplace verification of employees, establishes a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants currently in the country. But maybe we can use this kind of a debate to reflect upon the much broader benefits to our country that would accrue by improving our immigration system and continue to pursue a comprehensive solution. But regardless of whether we can get the more ambitious legislation, the bill before us today fixes a real problem that today harms our nation's competitiveness. That's why it has bipartisan support. That's why it's the right thing to do. I think it's terribly important for the area of our economy which is going to produce the most jobs in the future, the most competitive jobs with the highest profit margins that we can then sell to the rest of the world. So, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the sponsors of this legislation and would hope that we would get unanimous support for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My time is under the control of the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Appreciate your statement, and I would yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Tennessee yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, we have no additional speakers. I just want to again thank Chairman Smith. I also want to recognize the good work and the working relationship that I have with Ms. Lofgren of California and Luis Gutierrez, who's also been very instrumental. I think it does demonstrate that we can work in a bipartisan way to pass important legislation that really will have an effect on businesses, jobs, our economy, and a whole lot of families that are deservingly so. So I would urge support of 3012, and I'll yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3012 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair,
Mr. Speaker, I would object to the vote on the grounds that the quorum is not present and raise a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2192, the National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Extension Act of 2011.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 172, H.R. 2192, a bill to exempt for an additional 4-year period from the application of the means test presumption of abuse under Chapter 7, qualifying members of the reserve components of the armed forces and members of the National Guard who, after September 11, 2001, are called to active duty or to perform a homeland defense activity for not less than 90 days.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, and the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 2192, currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Before us today is an important bill sponsored by my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, and Mr. Forbes of Virginia. On the 10th anniversary of September 11, 2001, Americans paused to honor the memory of the innocent victims who perished that tragic day. We also were reminded of the bravery of American military personnel and thanked military families for their sacrifice. The last 10 years have been trying on our uniformed men and women, including our military reservists and members of the National Guard. About 1 million reservists and guardsmen have been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan over the past 10 years, for that we are very, very grateful. The federal government has a responsibility to ease the transition of reservists and guardsmen back into civilian life upon their return home from war. Many of them return home with physical handicaps. For many others, psychological challenges that face them and their families. Some of these veterans and their families have suffered financial hardships, and frequently bankruptcy is unfortunately the last resort. In a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, a debtor surrenders virtually all of their assets to the bankruptcy trustee and receives a discharge at the end of the short case. In contrast, in a Chapter 13 case, a debtor retains their assets but must commit their disposal income over the next 3 to 5 years to the repayment of their creditors before receiving a discharge from their debts. In 2005, Congress enacted the Bankruptcy Abuse Protection and Consumer Protection Act, often referred to as BAPSIPA. A significant policy goal of the Act was to combat a perceived abuse of the Chapter 7 bankruptcy. In BAPSIPA, Congress inserted into the Bankruptcy Code a way to determine whether a debtor has a disposable income that can be used to pay their debts. This is commonly referred to as the means test. If a debtor is able to pay some portion of their debts from their disposable monthly income, then their filing of a Chapter 7 bankruptcy is presumed to be an abuse of the bankruptcy system. The debtor remains eligible for relief under other bankruptcy chapters, including Chapter 13, where they can restructure how they pay their debts from their disposable income. In 2008, Congress recognized that military reservists and National Guardsmen sometimes suffer unique financial difficulty resulting from their military service. So we enacted the National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Act, which President Bush signed into law in October of 2008. That act allows reservists and National Guardsmen to bypass the means test, making it easier for them to file a Chapter 7 case. When they return from the front lines of war, they have endured enough. They do not need to also suffer a presumption of bankruptcy abuse if they are in need of a quick, fresh start in bankruptcy. That act expires in December of this year. H.R. 2192, which Mr. Cohen and Mr. Forbes have introduced, extends the sunset date of the act that was passed in 2008. America is still a nation at war, and we continue to call on our Guardsmen and Reservists to perform heroic tasks. During these trying times, Congress should not make life more difficult for these brave men and women by allowing these means test exemptions to lapse. The bill extends the sunset date by 4 years, at which time Congress will have the opportunity to re-examine whether this means test carve-out has served its purpose and whether it is needed any longer. I want to thank again Mr. Cohen and Mr. Forbes for introducing this important, timely legislation. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on the bill. This time I'll reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I consume as much time as I may, yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of H.R. 2192, the National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Extension Act of 2011. This bipartisan legislation, which I introduced in June of this year with Mr. Forbes, Mr. Rohrabacher, and others, ensures that certain members of the National Guard and Reserves who fall on hard economic times after their service to our country will continue to obtain bankruptcy relief without having to fill out the substantial paperwork required by the so-called means test under Chapter 7 of the Bankruptcy Code. H.R. 2192 simply extends the existing means test exception, which will expire in a few weeks if Congress fails to act. And act we should for our reservists and National Guards people who have put themselves in the line of fire for our country and our safeties and liberties. Under the means test, a Chapter 7 bankruptcy case is presumed to be an abuse of the bankruptcy process if it appears that the debtor has income in excess of certain thresholds. The National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Act of 2008 created an exception of the means test presumption for abuse for members of the National Guard and Reservists who, after September 11, 2001, served on active duty or in a Homeland Defense activity for at least 90 days. The exception remains available for 540 days after the service member leaves the military. The National Guard and Reservist Debt Relief Extension Act of 2011 would simply extend that exception until December 2015. This modest but important exception to the means test allows qualifying members of the National Guard and Reserves to obtain Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief without fulfilling the means test paperwork requirements. Since September 11, 2001, more than 815,000 members of the National Guard and Reserves have been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, with many having served multiple tours of duty. As of August of this year, members of the National Guard and Reserves made up 43% of U.S. forces serving in Iraq and Afghanistan and represent more than 20% of those killed in action and 20% of those wounded in action. Many of these citizen warriors have been asked to disrupt their civilian lives with little notice to serve their country in active war zones, and like other veterans returning from war zones, they often have difficulty adjusting to civilian life. It is estimated that approximately 40% of all Guard members will experience some sort of financial hardship, and that 26% of Guard members had money problems related to their deployment into war zones. H.R. 2192 is a meaningful way for our nation to recognize the tremendous sacrifice made by National Guard and Reserve members who have served on active duty or Homeland Defense since September 11, 2001, and may be suffering financial hardship. This bipartisan measure is in the tradition of the GI Bill, the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and numerous other provisions of law enacted to benefit military veterans. I thank Representative Forbes and Rohrabacher, two members of the Republican Party who worked with me on this and helped co-sponsor it, and Representative Schakowsky and Nadler of my party for co-sponsoring H.R. 2192. I also thank the Judiciary Chairman, Mr. Smith, the Ranking Member, Mr. Conyers, and the Subcommittee on Courts, Commercial and Administrative Law Chairman, the distinguished Mr. Howard Coble, for their assistance in moving this bill. This bill does indeed help reservists and National Guardsmen in a special way. But it also shows, as the previous bill that Mr. Chaffetz sponsored, shows that we in the Judiciary Committee can work in a bipartisan manner, and that Congress can work, and that we should be at least in double digits. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2192, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers at this time. I would encourage my colleagues to vote for us. It's a good day when we come to the floor of the House and vote in support of our Guardsmen and those serving in our military. I appreciate, again, the good bipartisan support and work, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Forbes, and others. So with that, I'll reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Tennessee.
I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields the balance of his time.
I'll yield the balance of our time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2192? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, I would object to the vote on the grounds that ask for a recorded vote. Ask for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
That too.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1801 as reported by the Committee of Homeland Security.
The clerk will report the title of the bill. Does the gentleman seek to call the bill as amended?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 182, H.R. 1801, a bill to amend Title 49 United States Code to provide for expedited security screenings for members of the armed forces.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Kravac, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Richardson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the bill under consideration today, H.R. 1801, the Risk-Based Security Screening for Members of the Armed Forces Act, is a bipartisan effort which directs TSA to establish an expedited screening process for members of the armed forces and their families in our traveling orders throughout our nation's airports. Currently, military service members traveling on orders must remove their Class A uniform blouse jackets, metal belt buckles, and insignia devices before proceeding through security checkpoints. While it is important every passenger undergo a security screening before boarding a plane, it makes absolutely no sense to require an American service member to take off their jackets and medals for TSA screening before boarding their flight home. Unless intelligence identifies a specific threat, we should honor our service members' willingness to sacrifice themselves for our country by treating them as patriots, not operating under the assumption that everyone intends to harm our country's transportation system. Importantly, this common-sense bill will streamline the screening process for our service members and lead to decreased checkpoint wait times for other American travelers. Moreover, this legislation will complement the TSA Administrator Pistol's move toward a risk-based checkpoint screening system for passengers and will prioritize members of the armed forces for inclusion into that process. I am pleased to report that after H.R. 1801 was passed unanimously with bipartisan support in committee, TSA has now begun testing a military ID reading pilot program for U.S. Armed Service members at Monterey Peninsula Airport in California. While this bill will not let a member of the Armed Forces bypass security, it will require TSA to develop an expedited screening process designed to reduce our service members' checkpoint waiting times and focus more resources on unknown and high-risk passengers. To be clear, this program does not impact the TSA's existing layered aviation security approach that includes federal air marshals, the last line of defense, federal flight deck officers, secure flight vetting, AIT machines, TSA intelligence analysts, explosive trace detections, canine teams, credentialing and boarding pass scanning systems, and behavior detection. It is merely part of a highly integrated risk-based analysis system that allows further concentration of limited resources on potentially higher-risk passengers. In close, I'd like to thank Transportation Security Committee Chairman Mike Rogers and Homeland Security Committee Chairman Peter King for moving this legislation, and all of my colleagues in committee, particularly Ranking Member Benny Thompson and Subcommittee Ranking Member Sheila Jackson-Lee for their support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1801 and yield myself such time as much as I might consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Chairman King and Ranking Member Thompson. As a member of the Committee on Homeland Security, I'm pleased that for the first time in this 112th Congress, the House is considering important transportation security legislation. H.R. 1801, the Risk-Based Security Screening for Members of the Armed Forces Act, requires that Transportation Security Administration to develop a plan for providing expedited screening for our military personnel at airport security checkpoints. Since 2001, there have been more than 2 million troops that have been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Last Congress, an earlier version of this legislation was accepted as an amendment on a bipartisan basis, as my colleague mentioned earlier. During consideration of the Transportation Security Administration Authorization Act, which passed this House by 397 votes in the aye, and 25 in the nay, but it was not acted upon by the Senate, unfortunately. H.R. 1801 properly recognizes the preciousness of time to our patriotic men and women serving in our armed services without compromising aviation security. This legislation will ensure that our troops and their families, including 236,963 defense personnel in my own home state in California, are given the opportunity to board an aircraft in a security-approved, expedited manner. Our troops help keep our country safe. The least we can do is devise methods that help speed up the screening process for our troops that are in uniform and are traveling on airplanes while on official duty. As our military presence in Iraq winds down, it is important that we remain cognizant of the burdens that deployments bear and their travel on service members and their families in times of war and peace. In addition to travel services, I support and urge this Congress, the Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security to strengthen all military services and programs for our troops, including increasing veteran recruitment efforts. Some of the additional military support that this Congress should consider would be 1, providing tax credits for hiring veterans looking for work, 2, strengthening much-needed training programs for separating service members, 3, encouraging businesses and government contractors to hire the brave men and women who have been deployed and have now returned with developed, valuable skills and professionalism while in the armed forces, 4, ensuring that the service members leave the military career-ready. H.R. 1801 is one of many opportunities for the American public and this Congress to demonstrate their support to those who are serving bravely. Further, it is important to note that consideration of H.R. 1801 marks the first time in this Congress that the House is considering a bill reported by the Committee on Homeland Security. I and other members of this committee look forward to this legislation not being our last. A number of common-sense Homeland Security bills are on the U.S. House of Representatives calendar and warrant timely consideration. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Therenfeld.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you. I rise also in support of H.R. 1801. As we come off of a holiday weekend, the most busy travel time in this country, many Americans have gone through the screening at our numerous airports. The TSA works hard screening everybody and to keep our flights safe. But we must always be looking for ways to make that system more efficient and safer. Members of our military, whom we know, who have served and put their life on the line for this country, should be among those who first in a program where we trust our travelers. We must continue to look for efficiencies to speed air travel. We must continue to look for ways to come with less invasive ways to screen passengers. We must look for ways to make traveling a more pleasant experience and a more profitable experience for the businessmen and women who travel. I urge support of this bill where we start where we should start, with members of our armed services. But there are other places we need to look to. Trusted traveler programs. Flight crews are receiving expedited screening. The TSA must continue to work to improve this process to make it safer and more efficient. And this bill gives the TSA the encouragement that they need and is a great step along the way to more efficient and private and better screening for our airport security. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from Minnesota has no more speakers, I'm prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close after the gentlewoman from California closes.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1801 is needed, it's common sense, and it's a piece of legislation with a history of bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues to support this measure and our troops. Their time is limited, and it certainly shouldn't be wasted in long lines at the airport. Airports all around the country have multiple checkpoints that expedite the security screening process, and our service personnel have earned this privilege as well. Likewise, I urge the Republican leadership to put on the House floor additional Homeland Security bills and bills aimed at easing our veterans' transition from military service to civilian careers. It's late November in the first session of this 112th Congress, and it's coming to an end, and the public is hurting, and Congress must act. With that, Mr. Speaker, on H.R. 1801, I urge my colleagues to unanimously support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from California for her support on this very important bill and our shared importance, value, and trust we place in our military service members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge support of H.R. 1801, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1801 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Speaker.
Mr. Speaker. Request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2465.
Does the gentleman seek to call the bill up as amended?
Yes.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2465, a bill to amend the Federal Employees Compensation Act.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 2465.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 2465, the Federal Workers' Compensation Modernization and Improvement Act. The legislation was approved unanimously by the House Education and Workforce Committee, a testament to its common sense, bipartisan policies. I urge my colleagues to support it. For more than 90 years, a workers' compensation program has provided assistance to federal employees who become injured or ill through a work-related activity. The program reflects our commitment to the men and women who serve our country in the federal government. Established by the Federal Employees Compensation Act, the program is administered by the Department of Labor, and in recent years, it has grown significantly in size and in cost. An estimated 3 million employees are covered by the program. During fiscal year 2010, beneficiaries received nearly $3 billion in workers' compensation. Unfortunately, this federal program has not been significantly reformed or updated in almost 40 years. And as is too often the case with government programs left unchecked for decades, waste and inefficiencies have crept into the system, leading to poor use of taxpayer resources and diminished support for the individuals the program is intended to serve. Through the oversight efforts of the Education and Workforce Committee, we have learned about a number of challenges confronting the program. For example, workers in rural areas like my own may have limited access to medical care. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, some compensation levels remain set to formulas that made sense during the days of the Second World War, but are inappropriate today. Clearly, reform is long overdue. Federal employees should have access to a program that reflects the realities of today's economy and takes into account the best practices in medical care. Taxpayers deserve a program that operates efficiently and effectively. That's why I, along with the other leaders on the Education and Workforce Committee, introduced the Federal Workers' Compensation Modernization and Improvement Act, an initial step in our effort to strengthen the program and bring it into the 21st century. The bill before us today advances this goal in 3 important ways. First, Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2465 enhances the efficiency of the Federal Workers' Compensation Program. The legislation allows physician assistants and advanced practice nurses, highly trained individuals in medical profession, to certify a worker's disability and ensure these professionals are reimbursed for their services. The bill also streamlines the claims process for workers who sustain a traumatic injury in an area of armed conflict.
These individuals can work in hostile and even deadly environments, and they should not have to wait months for benefits they are entitled to and the taxpayer wishes to afford them. Secondly, the legislation, Mr. Speaker, improves the integrity of the workers' compensation program. The Labor Department would be allowed to cross-check an employee's earnings with information held at the Social Security Administration, helping to provide workers the benefits they deserve, no more and no less. The Department would also be empowered to collect administrative costs and other expenses from agencies employing the workers, promoting greater accountability within the program for all federal agencies. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the legislation modernizes benefits to better meet the needs of today's workers, providing the level of support employees need and guaranteed that injuries or illnesses resulting from an act of terrorism are treated like other war risk hazards. The Federal Workers' Compensation Modernization and Improvement Act represents common sense reform federal workers and taxpayers deserve. I encourage my colleagues to support the legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2465, the Federal Workers' Compensation Modernization and Improvement Act. This legislation is a product of bipartisan cooperation and consensus, and I thank the chairman of the Workforce Protection Committee for being here and being the leader on this today. This legislation updates and improves the Federal Employees Compensation Act, or FECA, which provides a safety net to 2.7 million federal, civilian, and postal employees, ensuring they can continue to support their families and pay their bills if they're injured on the job. A core principle embedded in FECA is that workers should be no better off or no worse off for having suffered a work-related injury. The reforms in this bill are an initial step toward making FECA fairer and more efficient for taxpayers and the federal employees who depend on the program. H.R. 2465 updates benefits for funeral expenses and facial disfigurement, both which have not been updated since 1949. It ensures that injuries caused by acts of terrorism are covered and expands the pool of medical providers to include advanced practice nurses and physical assistants. It also expands the continuation of pay period from 45 days to 135 days for those who are injured overseas in a zone of armed conflict to make it easier to file for benefits. This legislation also will improve program integrity by allowing the Department of Labor to match its records against Social Security earnings information, ensuring that beneficiaries are not receiving prohibited salary for outside income at the same time they're receiving FECA benefits. Consistent with the government accountability recommendation, the bill allows the government to recover a portion of payments that were secured from third parties. Mr. Speaker, these common-sense bipartisan changes will make FECA more efficient and, according to the Congressional Budget Office, will produce savings for taxpayers and the Postal Service. The committee is also aware of Department of Labor proposals to slash benefits for workers while with dependents, reduce benefits for permanently disabled workers when they reach retirement age, and shrink survivor benefits. While the Department contends their proposal addresses inequities, they have not presented evidence that these changes will not create unintended consequences. For that reason, I was pleased to join Chairman Klein, Subcommittee Chairman Walberg, and Ranking Member Miller in sponsoring a July 8th request to the GAO asking that it assess the impacts of the Labor Department's proposed changes. The GAO report will be vital. It will be so important as we look for ways to further improve FECA without undermining its core values. Before we consider what we're going to be doing, we have to consider who is impacted by changes when we modify this law. And when we do, we have to keep in mind that FECA is these workers' exclusive remedy, which means injured workers and survivors of those killed on the job cannot sue the government for their losses. Leslie Black was a correctional officer at the Federal Correctional Institution in Bennettsville, South Carolina. When she was attacked by an inmate on May 2nd, 2007, she wrote this, and I quote her. She wrote, "The inmate who attacked me had embedded 2 razors into a plastic spoon by melting the spoon around the razors, creating a lethal weapon. With this weapon, he slashed my throat and right arm, causing severe bleeding, blood loss, and lacerations. Since this attack, my family and I have survived on a reduced income of my workers' compensation benefits and my husband's income, including his wages as a member of the Army National Guard. We have 3 children at home, and my workers' compensation benefits have been the difference between financial survival and financial ruin. We hardly live in the lap of luxury." That's the end of her quote. She hopes to return to work at the prison in a suitable position in the near future, Mr. Speaker. She asked, why would anyone want to cut benefits for someone who was hurt trying to keep the community safe? Well, given the public service provided by Leslie and other federal workers, I was disappointed to see that the Senate Committee on Homeland and Security Government Affairs has reported out postal reform legislation that adopted many of the Department of Labor's proposals to cut FECA, and then went a step further and cut them even more deeply without having first undertaken an analysis of those impacts. The Senate committee even imposed some of these cuts retroactively. Frankly, taking a meat axe to the FECA program without first doing your homework is irresponsible. It is my hope that the legislation before us today, coupled with a bipartisan commitment to study the matter with care, can serve as an example for the correct path forward improving FECA. These are not just numbers. They're not just percentages that we're dealing with. These changes could mean unjust impoverishment for a federal firefighter injured while battling a forest fire, or the widow of an FBI officer killed in the line of duty. Representative Gabby Giffords and her staff were covered under FECA following the tragic assault that killed 6 in Tucson, Arizona earlier this year. As we move forward, it is important that any further reforms are fair to both taxpayers and injured workers. While I appreciate the desire of some colleagues to move quickly to address their concerns about FECA, it is prudent to allow a few months for GAO to complete its work before redesigning the benefit structure. Mr. Speaker, I'm also troubled to learn that the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform decided to include changes to FECA in a postal reform bill that would create a separate postal workers' compensation system outside of FECA. All federal workers should be covered under the same workers' compensation system, regardless of which agency employs them. So pursuant to House rules, workers' compensation programs, including FECA, have been within the primary jurisdiction of the House Committee on Education and Workforce, and I expect that members of our committee will have an opportunity to weigh in on that bill before it moves forward. Mr. Speaker, H.R.